The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, represents a fascinating, yet often misunderstood era in human history. While popular culture frequently portrays this time as uniformly dark, superstitious, and primitive, the reality was far more complex and nuanced. This complexity extends to the realm of intoxication and altered states of consciousness, an aspect of medieval life that has received insufficient scholarly attention until relatively recently. The pursuit of altered consciousness through intoxicating substances is as old as humanity itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been seeking ways to alter their perception, mood, and consciousness through various natural substances for tens of thousands of years. The medieval period was no exception to this enduring human behavior. From the humblest peasant to the highest nobility, from the devout monk to the wandering minstrel, people across medieval Europe engaged with intoxicating substances for a variety of purposes. This comprehensive study aims to explore what getting high was like in medieval times, examining not only what substances were used and how they were consumed, but also delving into the experiences, cultural contexts, religious perspectives, and social attitudes surrounding intoxication in this pivotal historical period. By understanding how medieval people approached altered states of consciousness, we gain valuable insights into their worldview, medical practices, spiritual beliefs, and everyday lives. The medieval experience of intoxication differed significantly from our modern understanding. Today, we typically categorize substances as legal or illegal, medicinal or recreational, with clear distinctions between these categories. In medieval Europe, these boundaries were much more fluid. A substance might simultaneously serve as medicine, sacrament, recreational intoxicant, and magical tool, with little contradiction perceived between these uses. Moreover, the understanding of how these substances affected the body and mind was rooted in humoral theory and spiritual frameworks rather than modern neurochemistry. As we journey through the intoxicating landscape of medieval Europe, we will encounter familiar substances like alcohol and opium, alongside more exotic and dangerous intoxicants such as henbane, mandrake, and ergot. We will explore how these substances were prepared, consumed, and experienced, as well as how different social classes, regions, and religious traditions approached altered states of consciousness. Through primary sources, archaeological evidence, and contemporary scholarship, we will attempt to reconstruct what getting high was truly like for people living in this distant yet influential era of human history. To understand drug use in medieval Europe, we must first situate it within the broader historical context of the period. The medieval era emerged from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and was shaped by the synthesis of classical, Germanic, and Christian traditions. This cultural amalgamation influenced all aspects of life, including approaches to intoxication and altered states of consciousness. The early medieval period, roughly 5th–10th centuries, was characterized by significant political fragmentation, economic contraction, and cultural transformation across Europe. During this time, knowledge of classical medicine and pharmacology was preserved primarily in monastic settings and in the Islamic world. Many classical texts on medicinal plants and their properties were translated, copied, and studied by monks who maintained herb gardens that often included plants with psychoactive properties. By the High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, Europe experienced significant population growth, urbanization, and the flourishing of trade networks. This period saw the establishment of the first universities, the translation of Arabic medical texts into Latin, and the gradual dissemination of medical knowledge beyond monastic walls. Apothecaries became established in cities, and the trade in exotic substances, including intoxicants like opium, expanded significantly. The late Middle Ages, 14th to 15th centuries, brought profound challenges, including the devastating Black Death pandemic, climate change associated with the Little Ice Age, and widespread social upheaval. These traumatic events influenced attitudes toward intoxication in complex ways. On one hand, there was increased suspicion of herbalists and folk healers, sometimes manifesting in witch persecutions. On the other hand, the widespread suffering led to greater demand for pain relief and escapism, which various intoxicants could provide. Throughout the medieval period, several factors shaped the use and perception of intoxicating substances. 1. Medical framework. The dominant Galenic medical theory understood health as a balance of four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Intoxicating substances were often used to restore humoral balance, with their effects interpreted within this framework, rather than through modern concepts of neurochemistry. Number 2. Religious influence. Christianity's ambivalent relationship with intoxication profoundly shaped medieval attitudes. While the Church condemned drunkenness and excess, it also utilized wine in the Eucharist and recognized the medicinal value of many intoxicating substances. Monasteries became centers for the production of alcoholic beverages and the cultivation of medicinal herbs. 3. Agricultural practices. The types of intoxicants available were closely tied to what could be grown or obtained through trade. Barley and other grains for brewing beer were staple crops in northern Europe, while grapevines for wine flourished in Mediterranean regions. Many psychoactive plants grew wild or were cultivated in gardens. 4. Social stratification. Different social classes had access to different types and qualities of intoxicants. Nobility might enjoy imported spiced wines and exotic substances, while peasants relied more heavily on locally produced ales and wild-gathered herbs. 5. Folk traditions. Pre-Christian beliefs and practices persisted throughout the medieval period, especially in rural areas. These traditions often included the ritual use of intoxicating substances for divination, healing, or communing with supernatural forces. 6. Knowledge transmission. Information about intoxicating substances and their uses was transmitted through both written texts, herbals, medical treatises, and oral traditions. This knowledge often crossed cultural boundaries, with significant exchange between Christian, Islamic, and Jewish intellectual traditions. The medieval approach to intoxication was thus neither as restrictive as is sometimes imagined, nor as unregulated as in some earlier periods. Instead, it represented a complex negotiation between medical necessity, religious doctrine, cultural traditions, and human desire for altered states of consciousness. Understanding this context is essential for appreciating the medieval experience of getting high in all its complexity. Alcohol was by far the most commonly consumed intoxicant in medieval Europe, ingrained in daily life to an extent that would be difficult to overstate. Its ubiquity stemmed not only from its pleasurable effects, but also from practical necessity. Fermented beverages were often safer to drink than water, especially in urban areas where water sources were frequently contaminated. The primary alcoholic beverages in medieval Europe were beer, ale, wine, and mead, with significant regional variations in their production and consumption patterns. Northern Europe, particularly England, Germany, and the Low Countries, was dominated by beer and ale production. These grain-based beverages were typically brewed with barley, though other grains like wheat, oats, and rye were also used depending on availability and regional preferences. Medieval beer differed significantly from its modern counterparts. Early medieval ale was often a cloudy, unhopped beverage with a relatively short shelf life. The introduction of hops as a preservative and flavoring agent gradually spread throughout Europe during the medieval period, transforming ale into what we would recognize as beer. This innovation significantly extended the shelf life of the beverage and altered its taste profile, introducing bitter notes that balanced the sweetness of the malted grain. In Mediterranean regions, wine dominated the drinking culture. Vineyards flourished in France, Spain, Italy, and parts of Germany, producing a wide variety of wines. Medieval wine was typically stronger and sweeter than modern varieties, and it was almost always diluted with water before consumption. The practice of adding spices, honey, and herbs to wine was widespread, creating beverages known as hippocras, or spiced wines, that sometimes contained additional psychoactive ingredients. Mead, a fermented honey beverage, held particular cultural significance in Northern and Eastern Europe, where it was associated with feasting, celebration, and sometimes religious ritual. In regions like Scandinavia, mead featured prominently in cultural practices and mythology. Distilled spirits, while known in the later medieval period, were primarily used as medicinal preparations rather than recreational drinks. The technique of distillation, refined by Arab alchemists and introduced to Europe around the 12th century, initially produced what was called aqua vitae, water of life, used principally as medicine. Only gradually did distilled spirits become recreational beverages, a transition that was still underway at the close of the medieval period. The alcohol content of medieval beverages varied considerably. Ale and beer typically contained 2 to 3% alcohol by volume, making them relatively mild compared to modern beers. Wine could range from 10 to 14% alcohol by volume, though it was customarily diluted. The regular consumption of these beverages throughout the day resulted in a population that maintained a mild but constant level of inebriation. The experience of alcohol intoxication in medieval times would have been familiar in many ways to modern drinkers. Relaxation, reduced inhibition, sociability, and, with excessive consumption, impaired coordination, slurred speech, and eventually unconsciousness. However, the cultural framing of these effects differed significantly. Drunkenness was understood primarily in moral and religious terms rather than medical ones, with excess condemned as a sin of gluttony, while moderate consumption was accepted and even encouraged in appropriate social contexts. Different alcoholic beverages were associated with different social classes. Nobility and clergy had access to the finest wines, often imported from distant regions and spiced with expensive additives like cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. Urban craftsmen and merchants might enjoy good quality local ales or wines, while peasants typically consumed simpler, home-brewed beverages made from whatever grains or fruits were available locally. Alcohol played a central role in medieval sociability, featuring prominently in feasts, celebrations, and everyday meals. Taverns and alehouses served as important community gathering places, particularly in urban areas. The sharing of drinks sealed business deals, celebrated marriages, and marked important religious festivals. Even monasteries, despite their emphasis on moderation, produced some of the finest alcoholic beverages of the medieval period, with monks developing sophisticated brewing and winemaking techniques. The religious significance of alcohol, particularly wine, cannot be overstated. The Eucharistic transformation of wine into the blood of Christ stood at the center of Christian ritual, though it's important to note that ordinary laypeople typically received only the bread, not the wine, during communion through much of the medieval period. Nevertheless, this sacramental use of wine underscored the potential spiritual dimension of intoxication, distinguishing Christian attitudes from those of some other religious traditions. Medieval medical authorities recognized both the benefits and dangers of alcohol. Moderate consumption was believed to aid digestion, promote good humor, and strengthen the heart. Excessive drinking, however, was understood to damage the liver, brain, and nerves, with chronic alcoholism recognized as a debilitating condition. Alcoholic beverages also served as vehicles for medicinal herbs, with various infusions and tinctures prescribed for a wide range of ailments. Opium, derived from the seed capsules of the Papaver somniferum, opium poppy, has one of the longest documented histories of any psychoactive substance. Its use in medieval Europe represented a continuation of ancient practices, with knowledge of its effects and applications preserved through both classical medical texts and practical experience. The cultivation of opium poppies occurred throughout much of medieval Europe, particularly in Mediterranean regions, where climate conditions were favorable. The distinctive scarlet flowers and bulbous seed capsules of the plant made it easily identifiable, and its cultivation was often encouraged for both medicinal and culinary purposes. The seeds themselves, which contain minimal psychoactive compounds, were used in cooking, while the milky latex extracted from the unripe seed capsules provided the medicinal opium. Harvesting opium required skill and precise timing. The unripe seed capsules were carefully scored with a knife, allowing the white latex to seep out and be collected once it had dried to a brownish resin. This labor-intensive process resulted in relatively small quantities of the drug, making it a valuable commodity, especially in regions where the poppy did not grow well. In medieval medicine, opium was primarily valued for its pain-relieving and sleep-inducing properties, uses that had been well established since antiquity. Galen, the influential Greek physician whose medical theories dominated medieval medicine, had written extensively about opium's applications, and his recommendations were transmitted through Arabic medical texts that reached Europe during the High Middle Ages. Opium rarely appeared in its pure form in medieval preparations. Instead, it was typically incorporated into complex medicinal formulations alongside other ingredients. One of the most famous of these was theriac, an elaborate compound medicine containing dozens of ingredients, including opium, which was used to treat a wide range of conditions from poisoning to plague. Another significant preparation was a sleeping draught called dwale, which combined opium with other psychoactive plants like henbane and hemlock to produce a powerful anesthetic effect used during surgical procedures. The experience of opium intoxication in medieval times would have included pain relief, sedation, euphoria, and at higher doses, vivid dreams or hallucinations. These effects were interpreted through the framework of humoral medicine, with opium classified as a cold and dry substance that could counteract conditions of excessive heat and moisture in the body. The euphoric aspects of opium intoxication were generally viewed as secondary to its medicinal benefits, though awareness of its pleasurable effects certainly existed. Access to opium and opium-containing preparations varied considerably across social classes. Prepared medicines containing opium were expensive and primarily available to the wealthy or through monastic infirmaries. However, in regions where opium poppies grew, folk remedies utilizing the plant were likely more widely accessible. The cultural and religious dimensions of opium use in medieval Europe were less pronounced than those surrounding alcohol or certain hallucinogenic plants. Opium lacked strong associations with specific religious practices or social rituals. Instead, it was valued primarily for its practical medicinal applications, particularly in contexts of severe pain, insomnia, or surgical procedures. Medieval medical authorities were aware of opium's potential dangers, particularly the risk of overdose. Medical texts warned against excessive doses and noted symptoms of opium poisoning. There was also some recognition of dependency, with repeated use observed to require increasing doses to achieve the same effects. However, addiction as we understand it today was not clearly conceptualized, and the chronic use of opium-containing medicines was generally viewed as unproblematic if undertaken for legitimate medical reasons. The trade in opium and opium-containing preparations formed part of the broader commerce in medicinal substances. While some regions of Europe cultivated the opium poppy locally, higher quality opium was often imported from Eastern Mediterranean regions, particularly Turkey and Egypt, where cultivation and processing techniques had been refined over centuries. By the late medieval period, opium had become firmly established in European pharmacopoeia, with various preparations available through apothecaries in major cities. The drug's reputation as the most effective pain reliever available ensured its continued medical use despite awareness of its risks, setting the stage for the more widespread opium use that would develop in subsequent centuries. Cannabis sativa, occupied a multifaceted role in medieval European society. While primarily cultivated for its valuable fiber used in making rope, cloth, and paper, the psychoactive properties of the plant were also known and utilized, though to a lesser extent than in some other cultural contexts. Hemp cultivation was widespread throughout medieval Europe, with many regions mandating its growth due to its industrial importance, particularly for maritime powers that required vast quantities of rope for their ships. The plant grew well in varied climates, though the psychoactive potency of cannabis grown in northern Europe was likely lower than that grown in warmer southern regions. The psychoactive properties of cannabis reside primarily in the flowering tops and resin of female plants, which contain significant concentrations of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and other cannabinoids. While medieval Europeans did not understand the specific compounds responsible for cannabis's effects, they recognized the distinction between male and female plants and the greater medicinal potency of the latter. In medieval medicine, cannabis appeared in various herbals and pharmacopoeias, recommended primarily for its analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and sedative properties. The seeds, containing minimal psychoactive compounds but rich in nutritional value, were used in food and folk remedies. The leaves and flowers, containing higher concentrations of psychoactive compounds, were employed in preparations designed to relieve pain, induce sleep, or treat conditions like gout and certain types of swelling. Knowledge of cannabis's psychoactive effects came to medieval Europe through multiple channels. Classical sources, including works by Galen and Dioscorides, mentioned its mind-altering properties. Additionally, contact with the Islamic world, where cannabis, known as hashish, had a more established tradition of recreational and spiritual use, likely contributed to European awareness of these effects. The experience of cannabis intoxication in medieval Europe would have included relaxation, euphoria, altered perception, and at higher doses, possible hallucinations. These effects were typically interpreted through humoral theory, with cannabis classified as a hot and dry substance according to the Galenic system. The intoxicating effects might be viewed as either beneficial or harmful, depending on the context and the specific humoral imbalance being treated. Unlike alcohol, cannabis did not develop a strong cultural or social ritual around its recreational use in medieval Europe. Its consumption for intoxicating purposes appears to have been relatively limited and private rather than communal or ceremonial. This contrasts significantly with its status in other regions, particularly parts of the Islamic world and India, where more elaborate traditions of cannabis consumption developed. References to cannabis intoxication in medieval European literature are sparse compared to descriptions of alcohol inebriation. When mentioned, cannabis use is often associated with foreign cultures or with folk medicine rather than mainstream social practices. This relative silence in the sources suggests that while cannabis intoxication was known, it remained peripheral to dominant social and cultural practices in most of Europe. The religious dimension of cannabis use in medieval Europe was minimal compared to its role in some other religious traditions. Christianity did not incorporate cannabis into its rituals or symbolic systems, and church authorities generally did not single it out for specific condemnation beyond general prohibitions against intoxication. However, folk magical practices sometimes incorporated cannabis, particularly for its supposed ability to induce prophetic dreams or visions. Access to cannabis for its psychoactive properties likely varied significantly across regions and social classes. In areas where hemp cultivation was widespread, knowledge of the plant's psychoactive potential would have been more common, potentially leading to more frequent recreational or medicinal use. Urban dwellers might have encountered cannabis through apothecaries or through contact with travelers from regions where its use was more established. By the late medieval period, the distinction between industrial hemp and more psychoactive varieties of cannabis was recognized in some contexts, though not with the systematic clarity of modern botany. This awareness is reflected in the different terms used for the plant in various medieval texts and contexts, suggesting an understanding of the plant's varied potential uses and effects. Medieval Europe harbored a rich pharmacopoeia of psychoactive plants beyond the more widely consumed alcohol, opium, and cannabis. These plants, many belonging to the Solanaceae family nightshades, contained powerful alkaloids capable of producing profound alterations in consciousness, including vivid hallucinations, dissociative states, and experiences of flying or transformation. Their use straddled the boundaries between medicine, magic, and folklore, often carrying associations with witchcraft that became increasingly dangerous as the medieval period progressed. Hyoscyamus niger, commonly known as henbane, was one of the most significant psychoactive plants in medieval Europe. Native to the region and growing well in disturbed soils, henbane was both cultivated in monastic and domestic gardens and harvested from wild populations. The plant contains tropane alkaloids, primarily hyoscyamine and scopolamine, hyoscine, which produce powerful anticholinergic effects including hallucinations, sensations of flight, amnesia, and delirium. In medieval medicine, henbane was primarily valued for its analgesic, antispasmodic, and sedative properties. It appeared in numerous medical texts and herbals, recommended for conditions ranging from toothache to insomnia. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess and medical writer, documented its use for treating pain and inducing sleep, while cautioning about proper dosage. One of the most significant medicinal applications of henbane was as a component of surgical anesthetics. The medieval anesthetic known as dwale typically included henbane alongside other psychoactive substances like opium and hemlock. This preparation, applied both topically and internally, produced a state of unconsciousness that allowed surgeons to perform painful procedures such as amputations with reduced patient suffering. Beyond its legitimate medical uses, henbane developed strong associations with witchcraft and sorcery. The hallucinations produced by the plant, which often included sensations of flying or animal transformation, aligned closely with descriptions of witches' sabbaths and magical flight in late medieval witch-hunting literature. Evidence suggests that some of these experiences resulted from the topical application of henbane-containing ointments to mucous membranes or areas of thin skin. allowing the tropane alkaloids to enter the bloodstream while avoiding the potentially lethal effects of oral ingestion. The experience of henbane intoxication is vividly described in both medieval and early modern sources. Users reported vivid hallucinations, often of a fantastical or terrifying nature, sensations of flying or floating, extreme confusion, and upon awakening, amnesia regarding much of the experience. Physical effects included dilation of the pupils, dry mouth, increased heart rate, and in higher doses, respiratory depression that could lead to death. The transition between waking consciousness and the hallucinatory state was described as sudden and disorienting, unlike the more gradual onset of intoxication with substances like alcohol. Henbane's cultural significance extended beyond medicine and witchcraft into broader folklore and magical practices. Its association with prophecy and divination persisted from ancient traditions, with the smoke from burning henbane seeds sometimes used to induce visionary states for oracular purposes. The plant was also believed to have protective properties and was occasionally planted near houses to guard against malevolent spirits. Access to knowledge about henbane's properties and preparation methods varied across different segments of medieval society. Educated physicians and monastic herbalists had access to classical and Arabic texts detailing its medicinal applications, while folk healers likely relied on oral traditions and practical experience. This dual transmission created varied patterns of use and understanding, with official medicine emphasizing careful dosage and specific applications, while folk traditions might incorporate more magical or spiritual dimensions. The dangers of henbane were well recognized in medieval sources. Numerous texts warn of its potential lethality and described symptoms of overdose. These warnings reflect actual experience with the narrow therapeutic window of tropane alkaloids, where the difference between an effective medicinal dose and a lethal one can be small. Despite these dangers, henbane remained an important component of medieval pharmacopoeia, its risks accepted as the necessary cost of its valuable therapeutic properties. Mandragora officinarum, commonly known as mandrake, held a unique position in the medieval imagination. This Mediterranean plant, like henbane, contains tropane alkaloids that produce powerful psychoactive effects. What distinguished mandrake, however, was its anthropomorphic root, which was believed to resemble a human figure and was invested with extraordinary magical properties. Mandrake's natural range was primarily in southern Europe and the Middle East, making it less commonly encountered than henbane in northern regions. Nevertheless, its fame spread throughout Europe through medical texts, herbals, and folklore. By the High Middle Ages, the plant was cultivated in monastic and noble gardens in regions beyond its native range, though with variable success. The psychoactive properties of mandrake result from the same tropane alkaloids found in henbane, primarily hyoscyamine and scopolamine, producing similar effects, including hallucinations, sensations of flying, and delirium. In addition, mandrake has significant sedative and analgesic properties that made it valuable in medieval medicine for pain relief and as a surgical anesthetic. In medieval medical practice, mandrake appeared in numerous preparations. The root was typically dried, powdered, and administered in wine or incorporated into complex medicinal compounds. One of the most common applications was as a sleeping draught, used both for insomnia and as an anesthetic for painful procedures. Mandrake also featured in treatments for melancholy, convulsions, and various types of pain, particularly joint pain and headaches. The folkloric dimensions of mandrake far exceeded its medical applications. The root's resemblance to a human figure generated elaborate beliefs about its magical properties and the dangers associated with harvesting it. According to widespread legend, the mandrake root would emit a fatal scream when pulled from the ground. To avoid this deadly consequence, elaborate harvesting rituals were described involving dogs tied to the plant, which would be killed by the scream, while the human harvester remained safely out of earshot. These beliefs about mandrake were so pervasive that they appeared not only in folklore, but also in medical and botanical texts, where they were sometimes repeated alongside more practical information about the plant's medicinal properties. The 13th century physician Matthias Platyrius, for example, repeated the tale of the fatal scream in his influential work Circa Instans, though he expressed skepticism about its veracity. Mandrake's association with fertility and love magic was another significant aspect of its cultural profile. The root was believed to promote conception and was sometimes carried as an amulet by women hoping to become pregnant. This association may derive from the plant's resemblance to a human figure and its biblical mention in Genesis, where Rachel uses love apples, interpreted by many commentators as mandrake fruits, in her quest to conceive. The experience of mandrake intoxication, like that of henbane, would have included vivid hallucinations, sensations of flying or out-of-body experiences, and amnesia regarding much of the experience. Physical effects included pupil dilation, dry mouth, increased heart rate, and drowsiness, potentially progressing to unconsciousness. The hallucinatory experience was often characterized by a dreamlike quality, with the boundaries between waking and dreaming states blurred. Access to mandrake was more limited than that to more common psychoactive plants due to its restricted natural range and the difficulty of cultivating it in northern climates. This scarcity enhanced its mystique and value, making mandrake roots highly prized and expensive items. Fraudulent substitutes were common, with sellers shaping other roots to resemble the human figure associated with genuine mandrake. By the late medieval period, mandrake had become firmly associated with witchcraft and sorcery in the popular imagination. Its inclusion in flying ointments and its reputation for inducing visions made it a suspicious plant in the context of intensifying witch persecutions. Nevertheless, it retained its place in official medicine, demonstrating the complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward psychoactive substances in medieval culture. Atropa belladonna, commonly known as deadly nightshade or belladonna, beautiful lady in Italian, was among the most potent and dangerous psychoactive plants used in medieval Europe. Native to the continent and growing in woodland areas, this member of the Solanaceae family contains high concentrations of tropane alkaloids, primarily atropine, hyoscyamine, and scopolamine, making it both medically valuable and potentially lethal. The plant's common name, belladonna, derives from its cosmetic use by Italian women who applied drops of the plant's juice to dilate their pupils, producing a wide-eyed appearance considered beautiful. This practice highlights the fine line between beneficial and harmful applications of the plant, as even small amounts can cause significant physiological effects. In medieval medicine, belladonna was used more cautiously than henbane or mandrake due to its greater toxicity. Nevertheless, it appeared in treatments for conditions including muscle spasms, menstrual pain, and symptoms of Parkinson's disease, though not recognized as such at the time. Its powerful anticholinergic properties made it effective for these conditions, though the margin between therapeutic and toxic doses was extremely narrow. The psychoactive effects of belladonna intoxication are among the most dramatic of any plant used in medieval Europe. They include vivid and often terrifying hallucinations, complete confusion and delirium, sensations of flight, and severe amnesia regarding the experience. Physical effects include extreme pupil dilation, which can cause temporary blindness in bright light, elevated heart rate, hyperthermia, and severe dry mouth. In higher doses, these effects progress to convulsions, respiratory depression, and death. Belladonna's association with witchcraft and dark magic was particularly strong. The plant featured prominently in magical ointments and potions, valued for its ability to induce visions and sensations of flight. Some scholars argue that accounts of witches' sabbaths and magical flight in late medieval and early modern witch hunting literature may reflect experiences of belladonna intoxication, whether self-administered for magical purposes or used covertly against others. The cultural significance of belladonna extended beyond witchcraft into broader folklore. The plant was associated with the devil and with various malevolent supernatural beings in European folk traditions. Its berries, which are sweet-tasting despite their toxicity, were particularly dangerous as they could attract children who might mistake them for edible fruits. Numerous folk tales warned of this danger, describing the plant as the devil's berry or emphasizing its deadly nature. Access to knowledge about belladonna was more restricted than for some other psychoactive plants, particularly in official medical contexts, where its extreme toxicity made it less widely prescribed. However, folk knowledge of the plant persisted in rural areas, where it might be used in small amounts for specific purposes or avoided entirely due to awareness of its dangers. By the late medieval period, belladonna had acquired a sinister reputation that reflected both its actual toxicity and its cultural associations with witchcraft and the devil. Nevertheless, it remained part of the medical repertoire, eventually becoming an important source of pharmaceutical compounds in the modern era. This dual status as both poison and medicine exemplifies the complex relationship between toxicity and therapeutic value that characterized medieval approaches to psychoactive substances. Ergot, Claviceps purpurea, occupies a unique position among medieval psychoactive substances, as it was rarely used intentionally, but rather encountered as a contaminant of grain, particularly rye. This fungal parasite infects cereal grasses, replacing the normal grain with a hard, dark structure called a sclerotium, which contains numerous potent alkaloids, including ergotamine, ergometrine, and lysergic acid derivatives related to LSD. Ergot contamination of grain supplies occurred throughout medieval Europe, with outbreaks more common in wet years and in regions where rye was a staple crop, particularly northern and eastern Europe. When ergot-contaminated grain was milled and baked into bread, the resulting food contained varying levels of psychoactive and vasoconstrictive compounds that could produce both acute poisoning, ergotism, and psychedelic experiences. The acute form of ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire, was recognized as a distinct medical condition in the medieval period. Its symptoms included intense burning sensations in the extremities, painful muscle contractions, convulsions, hallucinations, psychosis, and in severe cases, gangrene necessitating amputation. Outbreaks could affect entire communities and were sometimes interpreted as divine punishment or demonic possession before their connection to contaminated grain was recognized. Beyond these acute symptoms, ergot intoxication could also produce psychedelic experiences similar in some ways to those induced by LSD, which is a semi-synthetic derivative of ergot alkaloids. These experiences included vivid hallucinations, synesthesia, the crossing of sensory modalities such as seeing sounds, altered perception of time, and mystical or religious experiences. Given the context of medieval Christianity, such experiences were typically interpreted through religious frameworks as either divine visions or demonic temptations. The relationship between ergot contamination and religious experiences has led some scholars to suggest that certain medieval mystical experiences and mass religious phenomena may have been influenced by unintentional ergot consumption. While such theories remain speculative and controversial, the psychedelic properties of ergot alkaloids could certainly have shaped the content and intensity of religious experiences for affected individuals. Unlike most other psychoactive substances discussed here, ergot was rarely used intentionally in medieval medicine. However, by the late medieval period, midwives and physicians had discovered that carefully prepared ergot could be used to induce labor and control postpartum bleeding, applications that derive from the ergot alkaloid's powerful effects on uterine smooth muscle. This medicinal use was hazardous given the difficulty of controlling dosage in crude preparations, but it represented an important application of a substance otherwise feared for its toxic effects. The experience of ergot intoxication differed significantly from that of other psychoactive substances used in the medieval period. The combination of painful physical symptoms with hallucinations and altered consciousness created a particularly terrifying experience for many victims. Those who survived severe ergotism often suffered long-term consequences, including gangrene requiring amputation, neurological damage, or psychological trauma. Medieval communities gradually developed strategies to reduce the risk of ergot poisoning. These included recognizing and removing the characteristic black ergot sclerotia from grain before milling, avoiding consumption of rye from fields known to be heavily infected, and in some regions, shifting agricultural practices to reduce reliance on rye in favor of less susceptible grains. Religious orders, particularly the Antonines, specialized in caring for victims of St. Anthony's fire, establishing hospitals throughout Europe for this purpose. The cultural impact of ergotism extended beyond its immediate medical consequences. Some scholars have suggested that ergot poisoning may have influenced witch persecutions in certain regions, as the bizarre behavior of ergotism victims could be interpreted as evidence of bewitchment or possession. Additionally, the shared hallucinatory experiences that might occur when multiple members of a community consumed contaminated grain could reinforce collective beliefs about supernatural phenomena. By the early modern period, the connection between ergot and St. Anthony's fire had been clearly established, though the specific chemical compounds responsible and their mechanisms of action would not be understood until modern times. This growing awareness represents an important example of medieval and early modern empirical observation, connecting cause and effect in the absence of modern scientific frameworks. Beyond ergot, various species of psychoactive mushrooms grew naturally throughout medieval Europe, offering potential avenues to altered states of consciousness. Unlike the plants previously discussed, which were often integrated into official medicine despite their dangers, psychoactive mushrooms occupied a more marginal position in medieval European pharmacopoeia and were more commonly associated with folk traditions and magical practices. The most significant psychoactive mushrooms available in medieval Europe belong to the psilocybe, amanita, and pineolus genera. Psilocybe semilanceata, liberty caps, containing psilocybin and psilocin, grew widely in pastures and grasslands across Europe. Amanita muscaria, fly agaric, containing muscimol and ibotenic acid, was common in woodlands, particularly in association with birch and pine trees. Various pineolus species containing psilocybin occurred in manured grasslands and meadows. Evidence for the deliberate use of these mushrooms in medieval Europe is more limited and ambiguous than for other psychoactive substances. Few explicit references appear in medical texts or herbals, suggesting that they remained largely outside the realm of official medicine. However, folkloric evidence and some archaeological findings suggest awareness of their psychoactive properties in certain contexts and regions. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, with its distinctive red cap and white spots, features in European folklore across multiple regions. Its association with supernatural beings, particularly fairies and elves in Germanic and Norse traditions, suggests recognition of its consciousness-altering properties. In some Northern European folk traditions, the fly agaric was associated with shamanic practices that predated Christianity, though these associations became increasingly obscured as Christian influence expanded. The experience of Amanita muscaria intoxication differs significantly from that produced by psilocybin mushrooms. Fly agaric produces an intoxication characterized by alternating periods of agitation and sedation, size distortions, macropsia and micropsia, where objects appear larger or smaller than their actual size, and vivid dreams or visions. These effects align with descriptions in various European folk tales, including potentially some elements of the Alice in Wonderland story, which some scholars suggest may have been influenced by cultural knowledge of fly agaric effects. Psilocybin mushrooms produce a different type of experience, characterized by visual and sometimes auditory hallucinations, synesthesia, profound alterations in thought patterns, and at higher doses, mystical experiences, including sensations of unity with the divine or the natural world. These effects typically begin 30 to 60 minutes after ingestion and last 4 to 6 hours, with a gradual return to normal consciousness. The potential religious or spiritual applications of these experiences existed in tension with Christian doctrine throughout the medieval period. While Christianity had incorporated certain altered states of consciousness, particularly those achieved through fasting, sleep deprivation, or contemplative practices, into its mystical traditions, the use of psychoactive substances for spiritual purposes was generally viewed with suspicion, particularly when associated with pre-Christian practices. Access to knowledge about psychoactive mushrooms likely varied significantly across regions and social groups. In areas with stronger remnants of pre-Christian traditions, particularly in Northern and Eastern Europe, awareness of these mushrooms' properties may have been more widespread and explicitly maintained. In regions where Christian influence had more thoroughly transformed folk practices, such knowledge might survive only in fragmentary or disguised forms, often reframed as warnings about poisonous or diabolical fungi. The dangers associated with mushroom use were well recognized in medieval Europe, though not always with accurate discrimination between species. Many mushroom poisonings occurred and continue to occur due to misidentification, with deadly toxic species mistaken for edible or psychoactive ones. This real danger reinforced cultural taboos around mushroom collection and consumption, with folk wisdom often advising caution about all wild fungi. By the late medieval period, the association between certain mushrooms and witchcraft had become established in some regions. The altered states, produced by psychoactive fungi, like those from tropane-containing plants, could align with descriptions of witches' sabbaths and magical flights in witch-hunting literature. However, explicit references to mushroom use in witchcraft accusations are rarer than those involving plants like henbane and belladonna. The cultural significance of psychoactive mushrooms in medieval Europe thus appears more subterranean than that of other intoxicants, reflected more in folklore, fairy tales, and possibly certain artistic motifs than in explicit medical or religious discourse. This marginal status may reflect both Christian suppression of pre-Christian practices and the genuine dangers associated with mushroom identification and consumption. The experience of intoxication in medieval times encompassed a wide spectrum of altered states, from the mild euphoria of low-dose alcohol consumption to the profound reality-shattering effects of certain plant-based hallucinogens. These experiences were shaped not only by the pharmacological properties of the substances consumed, but also by the set individual psychology and expectations and setting, physical and social environment in which consumption occurred. For the average medieval person, alcohol intoxication was the most commonly experienced altered state. The progression from sobriety through mild inebriation to drunkenness would have been familiar across all social classes, though the quality of the beverages consumed varied widely. The physical effects, relaxation, reduced coordination, slurred speech, heightened emotionality, and eventually nausea and unconsciousness, are well documented in medieval literature and art, suggesting widespread recognition of these experiences. The psychological effects of alcohol were understood primarily in terms of humoral theory, with alcohol believed to increase heat and moisture in the body. The resulting changes in mood and behavior were interpreted as stemming from these humoral shifts rather than from alcohol's effects on the brain as understood in modern neuroscience. Nevertheless, medieval observers accurately noted alcohol's disinhibiting effects, its tendency to amplify existing emotional states, and its potential to provoke both conviviality and aggression. Opium intoxication produced a different constellation of effects, centered on pain relief, sedation, and euphoria. Medieval medical texts describe the dreamy state induced by opium preparations, noting both the pleasant sensations and the potential for disturbing dreams or visions, particularly with higher doses. The physical effects of pupil constriction, constipation, and respiratory depression were also observed, though not always causally connected to the drug's consumption. The experience of cannabis intoxication appears less frequently in medieval European sources, suggesting either less widespread use or less cultural attention to its effects. When described, the effects align with modern understandings: relaxation, altered perception of time, heightened sensory awareness, and increased appetite. These effects were generally milder than those of the more potent psychoactive substances and less likely to provoke alarm or religious concern. The most dramatic altered states in medieval Europe resulted from the consumption of plants containing tropane alkaloids, henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, and from psychoactive fungi. These substances produced true hallucinations, perceptions with no basis in external reality, as opposed to the perceptual distortions more common with alcohol and cannabis. Users reported seeing entities, landscapes, and events that were entirely absent from their physical environment, often with a convincing sense of reality that made these experiences profoundly disorienting. Physical effects of these powerful hallucinogens included pupil dilation, sometimes so extreme as to cause temporary blindness in bright conditions, dry mouth, increased heart rate, hyperthermia, and difficulty urinating. These uncomfortable and potentially dangerous symptoms accompanied the psychological effects, creating experiences that were often frightening or painful, even as they were phenomenologically extraordinary. The flying sensations commonly associated with witches' ointments derived from several pharmacological effects. Tropane alkaloids can produce tactile hallucinations of floating or flying, while also inducing a dreamlike state in which the boundaries between imagination and perception become blurred. Additionally, the topical application of these substances to mucous membranes or thin skin, as occurred with flying ointments, could produce sensations of warmth and tingling that might be interpreted as ascending or flying in the context of appropriate cultural expectations. Ergot intoxication produced yet another distinctive experience: combining painful physical symptoms with profound alterations in perception and cognition. The LSD-like compounds in ergot could induce geometric visual hallucinations, synesthesia, and mystical experiences, while the vasoconstrictive ergot alkaloids simultaneously caused burning sensations and muscle contractions. This combination created a particularly harrowing form of intoxication that was almost never sought intentionally. Across all these substances, the interpretation of the intoxicated experience was shaped by medieval understandings of body, mind, and spirit. The humoral theory provided a framework for understanding physical effects, while Christian theology and remnants of pre-Christian belief systems informed interpretations of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of intoxication. Visions might be understood as divine revelation, demonic temptation, or contact with various non-human entities, depending on their content and the context in which they occurred. The setting in which intoxication occurred significantly influenced both the experience itself and its interpretation. Alcohol consumed during religious festivals, for instance, might facilitate a sense of communion with the divine and community solidarity, while the same degree of intoxication in a different context might be condemned as sinful excess. Similarly, tropane-induced hallucinations experienced in a magical or healing context would be interpreted differently from similar experiences occurring accidentally through plant poisoning. Individual psychology and expectation also shaped intoxicated experiences. A person consuming a psychoactive substance with specific expectations about its effects would likely experience phenomena aligned with those expectations, whether that meant religious visions, witches' flight, or medicinal relief. This interaction between pharmacology and psychology created variations in experience that reinforced diverse cultural interpretations of intoxication. By modern standards, the risk-to-benefit ratio of many medieval intoxicants would be considered unacceptable, particularly for the more dangerous hallucinogens. The narrow therapeutic window between effective and lethal doses, coupled with the crude methods of preparation and administration, created significant dangers that were recognized but accepted as necessary costs of the benefits these substances could provide. Medieval Europeans conceptualized intoxication through several overlapping frameworks: medical, religious, and magical folkloric. These different perspectives sometimes complemented and sometimes contradict one another, creating a complex intellectual landscape for understanding altered states of consciousness. The medical understanding of intoxication was grounded primarily in humoral theory, derived from Greco-Roman medicine, and elaborated by Arabic physicians whose works were translated into Latin during the High Middle Ages. According to this theory, health represented a balance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Intoxicating substances were understood to alter this balance, with different substances having different humoral properties. Alcohol, for instance, was classified as hot and moist, increasing blood, the hot and moist humor in the body. This explained the flushed skin, increased pulse, and heightened emotionality observed in drinkers. Opium, conversely, was considered cold and dry, useful for counteracting conditions of excessive heat and moisture. Cannabis occupied an intermediate position, sometimes classified as hot and dry, other times as having a more complex humoral profile. The effects of these substances were thus interpreted as temporary shifts in humoral balance, rather than as specific actions on the nervous system as understood in modern pharmacology. The medieval physician sought not to avoid all humoral imbalances, but rather to create beneficial ones that would counteract existing pathological conditions. In this context, intoxication could be medically appropriate if properly matched to the patient's humoral state. Beyond humoral theory, medieval medicine also recognized more specific effects of intoxicating substances. The pain-relieving properties of opium, the sleep-inducing effects of various psychoactive plants, and the digestive stimulation attributed to moderate alcohol consumption were all noted in medical texts. These observations, based on empirical experience rather than theoretical frameworks, sometimes provided more accurate and useful guidance than humoral theory alone. The religious understanding of intoxication in medieval Europe was shaped primarily by Christianity, though influenced by classical and indigenous European traditions. Christian perspectives on intoxication were complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, biblical passages warned against drunkenness, and theologians classified excessive intoxication as the sin of gluttony. On the other hand, wine held sacred significance in the Eucharist, and moderate alcohol consumption was generally accepted as part of everyday life. More powerful forms of intoxication posed greater theological challenges. Altered states of consciousness held an ambiguous position in Christian tradition. Some, such as those experienced by mystics through prayer and fasting, were valued as potential avenues to divine communion, while others, particularly those induced by substances associated with pagan practices, were suspect and potentially demonic. The visions experienced under the influence of powerful hallucinogens thus required careful discernment, with their source and meaning determined by their content and context. By the late medieval period, concerns about witchcraft intensified the religious suspicion of certain intoxicating substances. Plants like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna became increasingly associated with diabolical magic rather than legitimate medicine, though this shift occurred unevenly across different regions and social contexts. The experiences induced by these plants, particularly sensations of flight and encounters with non-human entities, align too closely with witchcraft narratives to avoid suspicion in an era of growing concern about demonic influence. The magical and folkloric understanding of intoxication drew on older traditions predating Christianity, though increasingly transformed by Christian influence. In this framework, psychoactive plants were often attributed personalities or spirits of their own, with proper relations with these plant spirits necessary for beneficial use. This animistic perspective survived more strongly in rural areas and in regions where Christianity had arrived later or asserted less complete dominance over local traditions. Folk knowledge about intoxicating substances was transmitted primarily through oral tradition and practical apprenticeship rather than written texts. This knowledge included practical information about identification, harvesting, preparation, and dosage, as well as cultural frameworks for interpreting the resulting experiences. The effectiveness of this transmission is evidenced by the persistence of certain plant uses across generations, despite their absence from official medical literature. The experiences produced by intoxicating substances were interpreted differently depending on which of these frameworks predominated in a given context. A hallucination might be understood as a humoral imbalance affecting the brain's imaginative faculty, as a divine or demonic vision requiring spiritual discernment, or as an encounter with plant spirits or other non-human entities. These different interpretations were not merely theoretical, but shaped the subjective experience itself, influencing what the intoxicated person perceived and how they integrated that perception into their understanding of the world. By the close of the medieval period, these various frameworks coexisted in complex relationships of dominance and subordination, with official medicine and Christian theology increasingly asserting authority over folk traditions. Nevertheless, older understandings persisted, sometimes openly and sometimes disguised within officially acceptable frameworks, maintaining the multifaceted character of medieval approaches to intoxication. The intoxication cultures of Northern Europe, including the British Isles, Scandinavia, and the northern parts of what are now Germany and Poland, developed distinctive characteristics shaped by climate, agricultural conditions, religious history, and cultural traditions. These regions experienced Christianity's influence later than Mediterranean areas, allowing pre-Christian practices and beliefs to persist more visibly into the medieval period. Alcohol consumption in Northern Europe centered primarily on beer and ale rather than wine, though mead held cultural significance, particularly in Scandinavia. The cool climate favored grain cultivation over viticulture, making beer the most accessible alcoholic beverage for most of the population. Beer production occurred at all levels of society, from monastic breweries producing high-quality ale to household brewing by peasant women creating simpler beverages for family consumption. The quality and strength of beer varied considerably across social classes. Nobility and wealthy monasteries produced stronger, clearer beers with consistent quality, while peasant brewing yielded weaker, cloudier beverages that spoiled more quickly. The introduction of hops as a preservative spread gradually across Northern Europe during the medieval period, transforming traditional ale into beer with extended shelf life and distinctive bitter flavoring. Drinking patterns in Northern Europe often featured episodes of heavy consumption followed by periods of relative sobriety, contrasting with the Mediterranean pattern of more moderate but continuous wine consumption. Feast days, harvests, weddings, and other celebrations became occasions for significant alcohol consumption across all social classes. This pattern of periodic intense intoxication features prominently in sources from the region, including both critical religious commentary and celebratory literary traditions. Distinctive to Northern Europe was the survival of pre-Christian drinking rituals into the Christian era, though increasingly modified by Christian influence. In Scandinavia, for instance, ceremonial toasts originally dedicated to Norse gods were gradually redirected to Christian saints, or secularized into general expressions of fellowship. The strong association between alcohol and communal bonding persisted throughout the medieval period, with shared drinking cementing social and political alliances. Beyond alcohol, Northern Europe possessed a rich tradition of psychoactive plant use, shaped by indigenous flora and folk medical practices. The colder climate limited the growth of some Mediterranean psychoactive plants, but favored others. Notably, fly agaric mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, grew abundantly in the birch and pine forests of Northern Europe, featuring in folklore and potentially in shamanic practices that predated Christianity. Plants containing tropane alkaloids, particularly henbane and belladonna, grew throughout much of Northern Europe and were incorporated into folk medicine and possibly magical practices. The connection between these plants and sensations of flight became particularly significant in the context of later witch persecutions, which occurred with particular intensity in certain Northern European regions. The cultural interpretation of intoxication in Northern Europe reflected the complex religious history of the region. The relatively late Christianization of some areas, particularly in Scandinavia and the Baltic, meant that pre-Christian attitudes toward altered states of consciousness exerted stronger influence than in regions with longer Christian histories. These older traditions sometimes viewed certain forms of intoxication as avenues to communication with non-human entities or access to special knowledge, perspectives that existed in tension with Christian frameworks. Medieval Northern European literature, including Norse sagas, Anglo-Saxon poetry, and later medieval romances frequently depicts intoxication, primarily through alcohol. These depictions range from celebratory to cautionary, reflecting the ambivalent cultural attitude toward altered states. The Old Norse concept of skaldskap, the poetic inspiration sometimes attributed to drinking the mead of poetry, represents a particularly explicit connection between intoxication and creativity in Northern European tradition. By the late medieval period, the witch persecutions that swept across parts of Europe found particularly fertile ground in certain northern regions. The association between specific psychoactive plants and witchcraft intensified, with knowledge of these plants becoming increasingly dangerous to possess or transmit. This shift did not eliminate traditional plant use, but drove it further underground, fragmenting the transmission of knowledge that had previously occurred more openly. The Mediterranean regions, including Italy, southern France, Spain, and parts of the Balkans, developed intoxication cultures significantly different from those of Northern Europe, shaped by their climate, agricultural patterns, longer history of Christianity, and stronger connections to Byzantine and Islamic civilizations. Wine dominated the alcohol landscape of Mediterranean Europe, where climate-favored viticulture and wine production had been established since ancient times. Unlike in Northern Europe, wine was accessible across social classes, though with significant variations in quality. Peasants typically consumed rough local wines, while nobility enjoyed finer varieties, often seasoned with honey and spices. The pattern of alcohol consumption in Mediterranean regions tended toward regular, moderate intake integrated into daily meals, rather than the feast-focused pattern more common in the north. Wine diluted with water was a standard beverage at meals for adults of all social classes, with undiluted wine reserved for specific celebratory contexts. This pattern, advocated by medical authorities including the influential Salernitan health regimen, was believed to promote good digestion and humoral balance when practiced in moderation. Mediterranean wine culture was shaped by both religious and medical frameworks. The centrality of wine in Christian ritual reinforced its cultural significance, while medical authorities from the Greco-Roman tradition had long prescribed moderate wine consumption for health. These influences created a generally positive attitude toward wine when consumed according to established cultural norms, with disapproval reserved for excessive consumption that violated these norms. Beyond alcohol, Mediterranean regions had access to a wider range of psychoactive substances than their northern counterparts, facilitated by the climate and by trade connections with the Islamic world and beyond. Opium was more readily available in Mediterranean regions, with poppies cultivated locally and opium also imported from Eastern Mediterranean and Middle Eastern sources. This greater availability is reflected in more frequent mentions of opium in Mediterranean medical texts compared to those from Northern Europe. Cannabis also had a stronger presence in Mediterranean intoxication culture, influenced by contact with the Islamic world where hashish use was established. While never achieving the cultural prominence it held in some Islamic regions, cannabis was known and used in Mediterranean Europe for both medicinal and recreational purposes, particularly in areas with stronger Islamic influence, such as Sicily and parts of Spain. The Mediterranean climate favored the growth of several powerful psychoactive plants, including mandrake, which grew naturally in the region. Knowledge of these plants derived from both classical Greco-Roman sources and from Arabic medical texts that became increasingly available through translation during the High Middle Ages. This textual transmission complemented oral traditions, creating a rich body of knowledge about psychoactive substances that bridged folk practice and scholarly medicine. The cultural interpretation of intoxication in Mediterranean Europe was strongly influenced by the region's longer history of Christianity and by the continuing influence of classical Greek and Roman perspectives. The humoral medical tradition was particularly strong in Mediterranean medical centers like Salerno, providing a sophisticated theoretical framework for understanding the effects of various intoxicants on the body and mind. Mediterranean literature depicts intoxication in ways reflecting the region's cultural attitudes. Boccaccio's Decameron, for instance, includes tales featuring drunkenness and its consequences, typically treating moderate intoxication as a normal part of social life, while portraying excess as folly. The poetry of the medieval Islamic world, which influenced Southern European literary traditions, sometimes featured more explicit celebrations of intoxication, including metaphorical associations between drunkenness and mystical experience. The relationship between intoxication and witchcraft developed differently in Mediterranean regions compared to Northern Europe. While concern about witchcraft certainly existed, the association between specific psychoactive plants and witchcraft accusations was sometimes less pronounced. In Italy, for instance, witchcraft concerns often focused more on alleged harmful magic, maleficia, than on the Sabbat and flying experiences that featured prominently in northern witch theories and that connected most directly to the effects of tropane-containing plants. By the late medieval period, Mediterranean intoxication cultures reflected the region's position at the crossroads of European, Islamic, and Byzantine civilizations. The resulting synthesis included elements from all these traditions, creating distinctive regional approaches to altered states of consciousness that influenced broader European cultures through the region's important centers of learning and culture. Eastern European regions, including what are now Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, developed intoxication cultures influenced by their geographical position between Western Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and various Asian cultures. These regions experienced significant political and religious changes throughout the medieval period, affecting patterns of substance use and cultural attitudes toward intoxication. The Byzantine Empire, continuing the traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire until its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, maintained more direct contact with ancient Greek medical knowledge than did Western Europe. Byzantine medical texts preserved classical understanding of psychoactive substances, including detailed information about opium, mandrake, and various psychoactive plants. This knowledge influenced Eastern European approaches to these substances, particularly in regions with stronger Byzantine cultural connections. Alcohol consumption in Eastern Europe featured greater diversity than in either Northern or Mediterranean Europe. Beer and mead were common in many regions, while areas suitable for viticulture produced wine. Distinctive to Eastern Europe was the earlier development of distilled spirits, with technologies spreading from the Islamic world through Byzantine territories and into Eastern European regions before becoming common in Western Europe. The distillation of grain-based spirits became particularly significant in regions like Russia and Poland, where rye and other grains were staple crops. By the late medieval period, these regions had developed traditions of distilled beverages that would eventually evolve into vodka, though early versions differed significantly from the modern product. Initially used primarily for medicinal purposes, these spirits gradually acquired social and recreational functions as well. Eastern European drinking patterns varied significantly across different cultural groups. In some regions, particularly those with stronger Byzantine influence, patterns resembled the Mediterranean model of regular, moderate consumption. In others, especially in northern areas, the feast-focused pattern of periodic heavy drinking predominated. Religious festivals, weddings, and other celebrations became occasions for significant alcohol consumption, sometimes extending over several days. The religious context of Eastern Europe added further complexity to attitudes toward intoxication. The region included areas of Western Catholic Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and in some periods and places, significant Jewish and Muslim populations. These different religious traditions brought varying perspectives on intoxication, from the Catholic emphasis on moderation to the Orthodox use of wine and liturgy, to the Islamic prohibition of alcohol. Beyond alcohol, Eastern Europe possessed indigenous traditions of psychoactive plant use, shaped by local flora and cultural practices. Regions with birch forests, including much of Russia, had access to fly agaric mushrooms, which featured in folklore and possibly in shamanic practices among some cultural groups. Plants containing tropane alkaloids grew throughout much of the region and were incorporated into folk medicine and magical practices. The cultural interpretation of intoxication in Eastern Europe reflected the region's complex religious and cultural landscape. In areas with stronger continuity of pre-Christian traditions, certain forms of intoxication might be associated with communication with spirits or access to special knowledge. In more thoroughly Christianized regions, interpretations aligned more closely with either Western or Eastern Christian frameworks, depending on the dominant religious influence. Byzantine medical understanding of intoxication, influencing Eastern European approaches, particularly in regions with stronger Byzantine connections, maintained greater continuity with classical Greek models than did Western European medicine during the early medieval period. The humoral system provided the theoretical framework, but Byzantine physicians maintained more detailed knowledge of specific substances and their effects, preserved through continuous textual transmission rather than the fragmentary preservation and later recovery that characterized Western Europe. Trade routes connecting Eastern Europe with Asian cultures introduced additional influences on intoxication practices. The Silk Road and other trade networks facilitated the exchange not only of goods but also of knowledge about psychoactive substances and their uses. These connections introduced Eastern European elites to substances and practices from distant cultures, creating syncretic traditions that combined local, Byzantine, and Asian elements. By the late medieval period, Eastern European intoxication cultures reflected their position at the intersection of multiple cultural influences. The resulting synthesis varied significantly across different regions, from areas closely aligned with Western European practices to those more strongly influenced by Byzantine or Asian traditions. This diversity created a complex landscape of intoxication practices that defies simple characterization, but that contributed important elements to later European approaches to altered states of consciousness. Christianity's relationship with intoxication throughout the medieval period was complex and sometimes contradictory, shaped by biblical texts, patristic writings, practical necessities, and ongoing negotiation with pre-Christian traditions. This relationship evolved over time and varied across different regions and social contexts, creating a nuanced landscape of religious attitudes toward altered states of consciousness. The foundational Christian perspective on intoxication derived from biblical passages addressing drunkenness and sobriety. The Bible contains both positive and negative references to wine and intoxication, while numerous passages condemn drunkenness as sinful. For example, Ephesians 5:18, "Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery." Others celebrate wine as a divine gift. Psalm 104:15, "Wine that gladdens human hearts." Most significantly, wine holds central importance in Christ's first miracle at Cana and in the institution of the Eucharist, creating a sacred association that complicated any simple condemnation of alcohol. Early Christian theologians, particularly the Church Fathers, attempted to resolve these tensions through an ethics of moderation. Augustine, for instance, condemned drunkenness while accepting moderate wine consumption, a position that became standard in medieval Christianity. This approach aligned with the classical virtue of temperance, which recommended the middle path between excess and deficiency in all bodily pleasures. The monastic tradition developed particularly nuanced approaches to intoxication. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many medieval monasteries, permitted a daily ration of wine for monks while warning against excess. Monasteries became centers of wine and beer production throughout medieval Europe, with monastic breweries and vineyards producing some of the finest alcoholic beverages of the period. This practical involvement with alcohol production coexisted with an ascetic tradition that emphasized sobriety and clear-headedness for prayer. The symbolic and sacramental significance of wine in Christian practice cannot be overstated. In the Eucharist, wine was transformed into the blood of Christ, creating the most sacred substance in Christian worship. This sacred intoxicant established a theological framework in which altered consciousness could potentially represent communion with the divine, rather than sinful indulgence. The tension between literal drunkenness, condemned as sin, and the symbolic intoxication of the Eucharist, celebrated as sacrament, shaped medieval Christian approaches to altered states. Beyond alcohol, Christian attitudes toward other intoxicants were more consistently cautious or condemnatory, particularly when these substances were associated with pre-Christian religious practices. Plants used in pagan rituals or traditional healing practices became increasingly suspect as the medieval period progressed, especially when their effects included visions or hallucinations that might compete with officially sanctioned religious experiences. The medieval Christian understanding of visions and mystical experiences created a complex framework for interpreting altered states of consciousness. While visions resulting from prayer, fasting, or divine grace were valued as potential revelations, those induced by substances associated with pagan practices were more likely to be attributed to demonic influence. This distinction became increasingly important in the late medieval period as concern about witchcraft intensified. However, the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable altered states remained permeable throughout the medieval period. The physical conditions believed to facilitate divine visions, fasting, sleep deprivation, intense concentration, themselves alter consciousness in ways that modern neuroscience would recognize as related to the effects of certain psychoactive substances. Medieval mystics sometimes described experiences remarkably similar to those reported under the influence of psychedelics, suggesting that physiologically similar states could be reached through different means and interpreted through different frameworks. Some medieval Christian healing traditions incorporated substances that modern science recognizes as psychoactive, though their effects were understood in different terms. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, physician, and mystic, described numerous medicinal plants with psychoactive properties in her medical works. These plants were prescribed for specific ailments according to humoral theory, rather than for their consciousness-altering effects, though these effects were sometimes noted as side effects requiring caution. The institutional church's position on intoxication was sometimes modified in practice by local circumstances and popular customs. Religious festivals often included significant alcohol consumption, creating temporary spaces where the usual boundaries of acceptable behavior, including sobriety, might be relaxed. These festive occasions, while sometimes criticized by religious reformers, were often tolerated as necessary outlets for social tension and as contexts where community bonds could be strengthened through shared celebration. By the late medieval period, increasing concern about witchcraft intensified suspicion of certain intoxicating substances, particularly those associated with flying ointments and Sabbat experiences. The effects of plants containing tropane alkaloids, vivid hallucinations, sensations of flight, encounters with non-human entities, aligned too closely with witchcraft narratives to avoid religious suspicion. Knowledge of these plants became increasingly dangerous to possess, particularly for women, and especially for those already marginalized within their communities. Despite these concerns, the medical use of psychoactive substances continued throughout the medieval period, often with explicit church approval when conducted within appropriate frameworks. Monastic infirmaries dispensed preparations containing opium, henbane, and other psychoactive substances for pain relief, sleep induction, and various other medical purposes. The distinction between legitimate medical use and illicit recreational or magical use remained central to Christian perspectives on these substances. Christian attitudes toward intoxication thus represented a continuous negotiation between competing values and practical considerations. The need to maintain social order and spiritual discipline balanced against recognition of both the practical necessity of substances like alcohol and the potential spiritual significance of certain altered states. This negotiation produced neither blanket condemnation nor unrestrained acceptance, but rather a complex set of distinctions that evolved throughout the medieval period in response to changing social, religious, and political circumstances.